Hey everyone, Mark Green here from diabetesdietguide.com and markgreennutrition.co.uk, which is my services page where I offer dietary and nutrition advice to patients with diabetes looking to lose weight and generally live a healthier life. Now I must apologise because I feel like I've been neglecting my type 1s out there. A lot of my videos are being pretty type 2 heavy of late, so I thought I'd do a video on something I've been seeing quite frequently in clinic and also corresponding with patients over email about. And that is post-meal glucose spikes. And this has been a problem because historically, when people would test on only their finger from a blood glucose test, we would generally see the pre-meal result and the pre-meal result at the next meal. So we see like a 4 or 5 hour gap, and as far as they were concerned, everything was okay. But since then, we're seeing more technology be introduced into the market, such as the Freestyle Libre and the Dexcom, which is continuous glucose monitoring devices. So actually now we're starting to get a much better idea of what glucose levels are doing between meals. And what I'm finding with a lot of patients is there are post-meal glucose spikes, which previously would have only been detected had they done a 1 hour or a 2 hour post-glucose test, which then really starts to rack up the number of tests they would have done, keeping in mind that a glucose or a finger prick test is still only one point in time, whereas with these continuous glucose monitoring devices, we can see the whole trend between meals and overnight. So we're getting a much broader picture of what the glucose response is doing. I've been working with some of my patients to try and find ways how to prevent these spikes in between meals, and generally speaking we've come up with 3 or 4 ways that have been pretty successful. They're not evidence-based, but actually from what's been happening in clinics and the data that I'm seeing, there's been some useful strategies we've been able to implement. So I just wanted to share some tips with you and see actually if it could help you out if this is something that you're seeing yourselves. But in order to do this and highlight what I'm talking about, we need to get digital. So let's get into the Mac. Okay, so I've drawn this out for you. So the black line that is to come will represent food. The blue line will represent insulin. On the left, you've got your glucose levels / your insulin response. At the bottom here, we have meal, so that's when you're going to eat. And then we have another label that's 4 to 5 hours later, or your next meal. Now the reason we've got the label 4 to 5 hours later is because that's how long your rapid insulin typically takes to have its full effect. Now, what usually happens is we eat, take the injection at the start of the meal, and this is what we're finding. Glucose levels are spiking, despite the fact that by the time we've tested at the next meal, they've come back to roughly where they started. So we can't increase the insulin. So if we increase it, they're going to hypo at that 4 to 5 hour period later. So increasing the insulin is going to be counterproductive. So it's more of a timing issue. So there's a few things we can play around with. So as we can see, this block right here, that's where the damage is being done. This is where we're seeing those post-meal spikes. Now, the first thing we can do to adjust for this is move the insulin. And this is because your rapid acting insulin takes about 30 minutes to get going, and then you won't see the peak of its action until about an hour after you've injected. So it's always playing catch up with food unless you move the injection, in which case we get a different kind of response. So by moving it 30 minutes before, this time the insulin's getting going and peaking around the same time that the food's doing the same thing. So it offsets the spike because it's able to keep it under control. Now this is probably textbook gold standard what we'd like to do, and if you've read a manual on diabetes and rapid acting insulin, it'd always say inject 30 minutes beforehand. So this is great advice, but it's not always the most practical advice. So I'd recommend only doing this at meals that you know you're going to eat. So breakfast is usually a prime example, because typically you're going to sit down, you eat it. Whereas when you're at work or you're out and about, you might inject 30 minutes before and then get called away, and then we set yourself up for disaster and probably a pretty big hypo. So we don't want to do that. The reason that breakfast tends to be a good time to do this is because breakfast tends to be one of those times that we have quite quick releasing carbohydrates. So things like cereals, regardless of what type, once you add the milk into the equation, it softens it up, which makes it quite quick releasing. It might be toast, which can be white bread, or we add things like jam and marmalades to it, in which case it becomes very quick releasing, and so it makes it very hard for the rapid insulin that you inject to keep up. So that's the first thing we can do. We can move the injection. The second thing we can do, in case you haven't already guessed, is we can change the type of food that you're having. So rather than having quick releasing carbohydrates, we can go to more slowly released carbohydrates. So rather than having things like white bread, white pasta, white rice, cereals as I mentioned, mashed potato, juice or sugary foods, we can move to whole grains, seeded, oats, overnight oats, whole potatoes, new potatoes, beans, pulses, lentils and vegetables. Much more favourable response, and if we plot it on the graph it looks a bit like this. So we have our meal, we've injected at the meal time this time, we haven't had to move the injection, but you can see the food is getting into the system much more slowly. So we've offset the rise by changing the type of food that we're having rather than having to move the injection. And this is another thing that I found with patients has actually worked pretty well. So hopefully that made sense, and I find actually drawing it out helps to sort of display the message that I'm trying to get across without just talking about it. I think it's much clearer when we can actually plot it out like that. But ultimately it comes down to a couple of different things. It is the timing of insulin. We can also change the type of carbohydrate that we're having, more slowly releasing ones as opposed to more quickly releasing ones, which can then be the difference between a spike and not a spike. There's other things you can do that help. So you might add in some protein and fat into the meal, because protein and fat actually slows down the absorption of carbohydrate because the body has a lot more to contend with. It has to break up the protein, it has to break up the fat as well as the carbohydrate, so it's got a lot more to do, which tends to be more favourable in terms of the glucose response. Okay, so a prime example of that would be rather than having just toast, you add in eggs with your toast. So you've got protein and fat on top of the carbohydrates, better glucose response. Then if you actually move the insulin a little bit earlier as well, you might just hit jackpot. The other thing that I've been finding does work to some degree, but there isn't much evidence to support it in the literature, is reducing the total carbohydrate intake at meals. Now, like I say, there's not a great deal of evidence to show that lower carbohydrate intakes improve type 1 diabetes outcomes, but in terms of these post-meal spikes, I have found that just by lowering the amount of carbs going in, it has been quite favourable for a lot of patients. And I suspect there's a few reasons for this. The first is if they underdose themselves or they miscalculate their insulin, then there's less carbohydrate going in to potentially cause a spike, so you physically have less potential for a spike. The other thing might be that because they're starting to pay more attention to their diet, actually what they've done is calculated their carbohydrates more closely, and so their rapid insulin dose matches their carbohydrate intake more closely. The other thing it might be is actually just the lower carbohydrate intake just improves outcomes generally speaking in terms of those post-meal spikes, but the evidence just hasn't been there to show it in the mass literature. So whatever the reason, it is just something that I found has helped some patients. So hopefully if you've been struggling with this is just a few ideas to play around with. Like I say, there's no guarantee it's going to work, but these are just some strategies I've been putting into place with my patients, and we've been having a fair bit of success with it. So I'd love to hear how you've been getting on with it. Try out some of these strategies, see how you get on. Let me know if it's worked, because ultimately the more data and the more tips I can get, because I don't know everything about this, you know, you guys are the experts, you're the ones living with it day in, day out. So you tell me, and I'll take it on board and tell other patients about things that are working for you too. And I think we'll call it a day there, so just make sure, remember to subscribe to the channel if you find this useful. Follow along on Facebook, just search Diabetes Diet Guy and my page will pop up. Join the community, interact, learn hints and tips and learn from others. And I'll be making more videos soon, so stay tuned and I will see you very soon.